I never intended for it to come to this. I told myself that countless times, but deep down I knew that was a lie. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some cruel accident. It was a choice, one that I had been making slowly, deliberately for the past year. The dining room was perfect. I had spent hours setting the table, ensuring every detail was just right. The linen napkins folded into elegant swans. The centerpiece, a garland of golden leaves intertwined with flickering candles. The turkey, its skin crisp and glistening, sat proudly at the center of the feast. Everything was curated to perfection, because tonight wasn't just about Thanksgiving. Tonight was about Stephen. I glanced at him as he lounged at the head of the table, the seat that used to belong to my husband, James. Stephen looked effortlessly composed, a man who had never had to fight for a place in the world. His wealth granted him an unshakable confidence, a presence that filled the room. The way he held his wine glass, swirling it lazily, was proof enough that he belonged here. James did not. My stomach twisted slightly when I heard the front door open. I had hoped foolishly that he wouldn't come home until later, that maybe he'd have sensed it, the shift in the air, the finality in the way I had been treating him these past months. But of course James always clung to hope. That was his greatest flaw. He stepped into the doorway holding Sophie's tiny hand, and for the first time that evening guilt pricked at me. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, her brown eyes wide and confused as they scanned the table. It was set for 7. 7 places, yet none for her. None for him. James didn't speak at first. He just stared, his gaze moving slowly from the feast to the empty spot where his plate should have been, to me. He was waiting for an explanation. I didn't owe him one. "This table is for rich husbands only," I said. The words left my mouth smoother than I expected. Practiced even. And in a way they were. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times, preparing myself for the look in his eyes. But nothing could have truly braced me for the way his face fell, the way the warmth drained from him all at once. Sophie inhaled sharply beside him, her tiny fingers gripping his tighter. Stephen chuckled, breaking the silence. "Maybe you should just disappear," he said, swirling his wine as if he were making casual conversation. James's jaw clenched. For a split second I wondered if he'd explode. If he'd finally let his anger get the better of him and lash out. A part of me almost wanted him to make this ugly, to make me feel justified in what I had done. But he didn't. He just exhaled long and slow and then turned to Sophie. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured. "Let's go." And just like that he walked away. No fight. No accusations. No theatrics. He just left. I watched as Sophie broke into quiet, trembling sobs, but James didn't comfort her. He didn't stop or look back. He simply took her hand and led her away, out the door, into the cold November night. I swallowed, forcing my shoulders back. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Stephen took another sip of wine, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Well," he drawled, setting his glass down. "That was easier than I expected." I nodded, but my stomach churned. I had won. So why did it feel like I had lost? I sat at the head of the table, staring at the untouched plate in front of me. The golden candlelight flickered against the expensive silverware. The rich scent of roasted turkey and spiced cranberries thick in the air. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as I had planned. And yet the room felt cold. The sound of the front door clicking shut lingered longer than it should have. My fingers tightened around my wine glass as I forced my gaze to the others at the table. Stephen, his usual smirk in place, and the guests who had become more a part of my life than my own husband ever had. "Well," Stephen said, cutting through the thick silence. "That was awkward." A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. Christine and Alan, 2 of Stephen's closest friends, shifted in their seats, pretending to be fascinated by their wine. His sister, Valerie, just shook her head with a bemused expression. I took a slow sip, letting the cool burn of the alcohol settle my nerves. "It had to be done," I said smoothly. "James wasn't going to leave on his own. He had to see that he doesn't belong here anymore." Stephen leaned back, watching me with sharp, calculating eyes. "And your daughter?" I stiffened. "Sophie." Her teary brown eyes flashed through my mind, her small fingers trembling in James's grip as he led her away. The guilt had barely settled before I shoved it down. locking it away like I had done for months now. She'll adjust, I said, though the words felt thin, hollow. Christine cleared her throat, finally picking up her fork and poking at the mashed potatoes. You're really sure about this, Laura? She asked carefully. I mean, it's one thing to leave your husband, but... She trailed off, glancing toward the door. But doing it like this? That's what she wanted to say. I pushed my plate aside, my appetite gone. James has been holding me back for years, I said. We were struggling financially. Always budgeting, always cutting corners. That's not the life I want. I turned to Stephen, my tone softening. That's not the life I deserve. Stephen's smirk widened. He reached for my hand across the table, his touch warm and firm. You deserve the best, babe. Christine and Alan exchanged another glance, but I ignored it. Let them judge. They didn't know what it was like to be married to a man like James. So content with mediocrity, so willing to scrape by instead of reaching for more. I had spent years believing in him, waiting for him to be more ambitious, to want something bigger for us. But he never did. And I was tired of waiting. Stephen had given me a taste of something better. A life with no limits, no sacrifices. He had shown me what it was like to have power, to be admired. To walk into a room and have people know you mattered. James was never going to give me that. So why did I feel so hollow? I stood up abruptly, reaching for the wine bottle. Excuse me, I muttered, heading toward the kitchen. As soon as I was alone, I let out a breath, my fingers tightening around the countertop. I could still hear the murmur of conversation behind me, the clinking of glasses. They were all moving on, already forgetting what had just happened. So why couldn't I? I exhaled sharply and turned toward the fridge, pulling out the leftovers I had packed earlier. Without thinking, I reached for a container and spooned some turkey inside. Then mashed potatoes. Then cranberry sauce. I paused. What was I doing? I swallowed hard, staring at the container in my hands. James and Sophie were gone. They had no place in this house anymore. So why was I? Laura. I spun around, heart hammering. Stephen leaned against the doorway, watching me with an amused expression. Midnight snack, he teased. I forced a laugh. Just cleaning up. His eyes flicked to the container in my hands, and for a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his face. Then he smirked. Good, he said, stepping closer. Because you don't owe him anything. I nodded stiffly, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to throw the food away. Stephen took the container from my hands and set it on the counter. His fingers tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his gaze. You made the right choice, Laura, he murmured, his lips brushing against mine. This is your life now. I closed my eyes, willing myself to believe him. Then why did it feel like I had just lost everything? The house was silent when I woke up the next morning. For years I had started my mornings the same way. James humming softly in the kitchen as he made coffee, Sophie padding into our room, still wrapped in the warmth of her blankets, her sleepy voice asking if it was time for breakfast. Today there was nothing. Just an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. I rolled over, expecting to find Stephen beside me, but his side of the bed was empty. A faint scent of his cologne still lingered on the pillow. A reminder that this was his house now. Our house. I pushed back the covers and padded into the kitchen. Stephen was already at the island, reading something on his tablet. He was freshly showered, his hair neatly combed back, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't look up when I entered. Morning, I murmured, reaching for a mug. Morning, he replied, but his voice was distracted. I poured my coffee, sneaking a glance at him. Something felt different. The confidence was still there, the effortless charm. But there was a distance too. Maybe I was imagining it. I leaned against the counter, sipping my drink. You left early. Stephen finally glanced up, giving me that familiar smirk. Had some work to handle. On a holiday weekend? He shrugged. Big money doesn't take days off. I nodded, but something about the way he said it left me unsettled. Laura. I turned. Stephen was watching me, his fingers drumming lightly on the counter. Are you going to be okay? I frowned. What do you mean? He sighed, setting his tablet down. Last night. I stiffened. You seemed off, he continued. I just want to make sure you don't have any second thoughts. I swallowed, forcing a smile. I don't. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer. Then he nodded, as if satisfied. Good. Because James isn't coming back. I nodded, gripping my mug tighter. I know. But was Sophie? I shook the thought away before it could take root. I had made my choice. There was no going back. I spent the day keeping myself busy. Decorating for Christmas, organizing my closet, anything to stop myself from checking my phone. But by the time the sun had started setting, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone, my fingers hesitating over James's contact. I had no reason to call him. No reason to care where he was. But Sophie. Before I could talk myself out of it, I tapped the screen. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. Silence. Then his voice, calm, unreadable. What do you want, Laura? My heart jumped. I hadn't realized how much I had missed hearing his voice until now. I gripped the counter, steadying myself. I hesitated. I wanted to check on Sophie. A pause. She's fine, James said coolly. I exhaled, relieved. Where is she? With me. That wasn't an answer. James. My voice hardened. Where are you? Why does it matter? I blinked. He had never spoken to me like that before. James was patient, level-headed. Even when we fought, he never let his voice rise in anger. But now? Now there was an edge to his words, sharp, unforgiving. I swallowed. I wanted to talk to her. More silence. Then he sighed. Sophie, he called. His voice muffled as he pulled the phone away. A moment later, her small voice came through the line. Mom. I let out a shaky breath. Hi, sweetheart. There was a long pause. Then softly. Why didn't you save me a plate? The words hit me harder than I expected. My throat tightened. It's complicated, baby. Sophie sniffled. Daddy says we don't have a home anymore. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. That's not true. Then why aren't we there? I squeezed my eyes shut. I had prepared for James's anger, his bitterness. But not this. Not Sophie's confusion. Honey, I said gently. I thought you and Daddy might need some time away. Another silence. Then. Are you coming to get us? The question knocked the breath from my lungs. I knew what she was really asking. Do I still have a place in your life? Before I could answer, James's voice came back on the line. That's enough, Sophie. Say goodbye to your mother. There was a muffled protest, but then her voice returned, smaller this time. Bye, Mommy. The line went dead and I stood there for a long time staring at my phone. Somewhere in the distance I heard Stephen moving around, pouring himself another drink. Everything good? He called. I opened my mouth to say yes. But before I could, my fingers clenched around the phone. And the next thing I knew, it was flying through the air, smashing against the kitchen wall with a sharp, shattering crack. The sound echoed through the house. Stephen turned, raising an eyebrow. Huh. I was breathing hard, my chest rising and falling rapidly, my hands still shaking. He smirked, swirling his drink. You know, that's the first time I've ever seen you lose control. I didn't respond. I just stared at the broken glass, at the shattered remains of my phone lying in pieces on the floor. And all I could think was, maybe it wasn't the only thing I had destroyed. The shattered remains of my phone still lay on the kitchen floor the next morning. Stephen had said nothing about it. He had merely stepped over the mess with a smirk, poured himself another drink, and retreated to his study, where he had been making phone calls late into the night. I had sat at the kitchen island, staring at the broken pieces, unmoving. I should have cleaned it up, should have swept away the evidence of my outburst. But I didn't, because deep down I knew the mess wasn't just on the floor. It was inside me. The silence in the house was unbearable. I tried to keep busy, turning on the TV, flipping through magazines, reorganizing the spice cabinet. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. James's shoes were no longer by the door. Sophie's backpack wasn't tossed carelessly onto the couch. Her stuffed rabbit, the one she dragged everywhere, wasn't peeking out from under the coffee table. I had wanted this, hadn't I? A house free of clutter, free of distractions. Free of them. So why did it feel like a tomb? I sat on the couch, running my fingers through my hair, when I heard the front door open. Stephen strode in, carrying a stack of papers. He was dressed sharply as always, his navy suit perfectly pressed, his gold cufflinks gleaming under the light. "Morning, babe," he said smoothly, setting the papers down on the coffee table. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice hoarse from lack of use. "Meetings," he replied, checking his watch. "Investors don't wait for the holidays." I nodded numbly. Stephen's world moved at a different pace than mine had with James. There was no pause, no sentimentality. Everything was transactional, every action a calculated move toward something bigger. I had thought I wanted to be part of that world. But now, sitting in this empty house, I wasn't so sure. Stephen glanced at me, then at the broken phone still on the kitchen floor. His lips twitched in amusement. "Still feeling dramatic?" I exhaled sharply, standing up. "I need a new phone." "Already handled," he said, pulling a sleek new device from his pocket and tossing it onto the couch. "You're welcome." I caught it, staring at the unfamiliar screen. My old phone, my texts, my call history, my saved voicemails from Sophie were all gone. Erased. Stephen watched me, sipping his coffee. "No more distractions." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Right. No more distractions. No more looking back." Later that evening, as Stephen worked in his study, I sat in bed scrolling through my new phone, trying to reset all my accounts. That's when I saw it. An email. From James. My breath caught as I opened it, my fingers trembling. The message was short. "I'll be by on Sunday to pick up Sophie's things. Have them ready." No emotion. No anger. Just a simple, clinical instruction. As if I were nothing more than a transaction. A chill ran down my spine. James had always been steady, dependable. Even in our worst fights, he had never been cold. Never detached. But now? Now it was as if he had erased me the same way Stephen had erased my phone. And maybe I deserved it. Sunday came faster than I wanted it to. I spent the morning packing Sophie's things into boxes. Her clothes, her books, her toys. Every stuffed animal, every drawing she had ever proudly taped to the fridge, went into neatly labeled containers. When I reached for her favorite stuffed rabbit, the one she had since she was a baby, I hesitated. Would she want to take it? Or had I already ruined the only memory she had of this house? I clutched the rabbit to my chest, my eyes burning. I had told myself that she would adjust. That children were resilient. But what if I had been wrong? What if she never forgave me? A knock at the door made me jolt. He was here. I wiped my face quickly and composed myself before opening the door. James stood on the porch, his face unreadable. He looked different. His hair was slightly unkempt, his jawline sharper than I remembered. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the living room. The dining table was still set from Thanksgiving. The fine china, the untouched wine glasses. Everything was exactly as it had been that night. His gaze flickered toward the boxes stacked neatly by the door. "That everything?" he asked. I nodded. He stepped forward, lifting one box easily, his movements practiced. For years, he had carried the weight of this family. And now he was carrying its remains. I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words caught in my throat. He picked up another box, his expression impassive. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't lingering. He was simply doing what needed to be done. The way he always had. I gripped the rabbit tighter. "James." He paused but didn't look at me. I swallowed hard. She cried that night. He exhaled, his shoulders tensing. She asked why I didn't save her a plate. My voice cracked. I didn't think. Didn't think about her? His voice was quiet, but the weight of it crushed me. Or didn't care? I flinched. That's not fair. He finally turned, his blue eyes colder than I had ever seen them. Isn't it? I opened my mouth but no words came. James studied me for a long moment. Then without another word, he turned back to the boxes. Hefting them easily, he walked out the door. I stood there, clutching the stuffed rabbit, watching as he loaded the car. Watching as the last pieces of my family were packed away. Watching as my daughter's world left this house. As he got into the car, he didn't look back. I wanted to call out to him, to say something, to fix it. But the moment was already gone. And so was he. That night I sat in the dark, the stuffed rabbit still in my lap. Stephen had gone out with friends. He hadn't asked about James, hadn't asked about Sophie's things, hadn't asked about me. The house was quiet again. But this time the silence was deafening. Because this time I knew for certain. I had finally lost everything. The first night without Sophie was the hardest. I had told myself it wouldn't be. I had convinced myself that I would finally be able to relax, to enjoy the life I had chosen. No more making lunches before school. No more scattered toys, no more endless piles of laundry. I had imagined peace, freedom. But as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. The house felt unnatural, as if something had been ripped from it. Or maybe something had been ripped from me. I reached for my phone. My new pristine phone with no history, and hesitated. I had no messages, no missed calls, no unread texts from James or Sophie. I had told myself I wouldn't reach out first. But I did. Me. Is she okay? I waited, my breath shallow. A minute passed. Then 5. Then 10. Nothing. James wasn't going to respond. And that was when I realized this time he really was done with me. Stephen was already up by the time I pulled myself from bed the next morning. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air. But it wasn't comforting. Not like it had been with James. With James, coffee had been part of our mornings, a ritual we shared. He used to make mine just the way I liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream. He would hand it to me with a quiet smile, a gentle kiss to my forehead. Stephen, on the other hand, made his own coffee and left mine in the pot to go cold. I poured myself a cup anyway, but when I took a sip it was bitter. "You look like hell," Stephen remarked from the dining table, scrolling through his phone. I stiffened. "Thanks." He smirked. "Rough night." I didn't answer. I just pulled my robe tighter around myself and took another sip of the awful coffee. Stephen finally set his phone down, watching me over the rim of his mug. "You thinking about him?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected him to ignore the entire situation like he had last night. I forced a laugh. "Who?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar, Laura." I bristled. "I'm not lying." His gaze darkened, but not with anger. With amusement. "Listen," he said, setting his coffee down and leaning forward. "I don't care if you're feeling guilty. It doesn't change anything. You made your choice." I stared at him. He was right. I had made my choice. So why did it feel like I had lost? That afternoon I forced myself to leave the house. I needed air. Needed to be anywhere but inside those suffocating walls. I drove aimlessly for a while before ending up at the one place I hadn't allowed myself to go since Thanksgiving. James's neighborhood. It wasn't ours anymore. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the wheel as I stared at the modest home we had shared. The porch light was on. Sophie's pink bicycle was leaned against the garage. James's truck was in the driveway. They were building a life without me. And I wasn't part of it. I told myself to drive away. Instead I reached for my phone. Me. I have something of Sophie's. I can drop it off. This time I didn't have to wait long. "James. Leave it on the porch." A lump formed in my throat. Not "I'll come get it." Not "you can see her." Just leave it. Like a package. Like I was nothing more than a stranger. I swallowed hard, grabbed the stuffed rabbit from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. Each step toward the porch felt heavier. I had stood here countless times before, fumbling for my keys, calling Sophie to hurry up, kissing James goodbye before heading to work. Now I was an intruder. I set the rabbit down on the wooden step, my fingers lingering over the worn fabric. Then I turned to leave. I had just reached my car when the door opened. And there he was. James. He looked different. Not just tired. Not just worn. Hardened. His blue eyes, once filled with warmth, now held something unreadable. His posture was tense, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, as if he were holding himself back. We stood there staring at each other, the air between us thick with words left unspoken. I swallowed. "James. Is that all?" I flinched. "What?" He gestured to the rabbit on the porch. "Is that all you wanted?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him I had made a mistake, that I hadn't thought things through, that I missed them. But I had lost that right, hadn't I? So instead I nodded. "Yeah." James exhaled sharply, then bent down, picking up the rabbit. He turned, stepping back inside without another word. The door shut behind him, and I was alone again. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. Stephen was gone when I got back. The house was empty again. I poured myself a drink, then another. I sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched place settings from Thanksgiving, the ones I had so carefully arranged. The table was full that night. Now it was empty. I had gotten everything I thought I wanted, and yet I had never felt more alone. The days blurred together after that. I kept telling myself that this was just an adjustment period, that things would settle, that I would feel whole again soon. But the feeling never came. I spent my mornings in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for Stephen to leave so I wouldn't have to pretend. I'd only crawl out of bed once the house was empty, padding into the kitchen where I would make coffee I never finished. I scrolled through my phone absent-mindedly, knowing there were no messages waiting for me. No calls. No check-ins from Sophie. James was serious. He was cutting me out completely. And worst of all, he was making it easy for me to pretend I didn't care. One afternoon, I decided to clean. Maybe if the house looked different, it would feel different. Maybe if I erased the last traces of my old life, I could finally let go of the weight pressing on my chest. I started in the closet, pulling down boxes I hadn't touched in years. Old photo albums, Christmas decorations, Sophie's school projects. I opened one of the albums and the breath caught in my throat. There we were, James and me, younger, happier, standing in front of our first apartment. He had his arm wrapped around me, grinning, his eyes filled with the kind of love that once made me feel invincible. I flipped the page. Sophie, barely a year old, bundled up in her winter coat, reaching for the first snowfall of the season. James stood beside her, his expression soft, adoring. Another page. Our wedding day. I snapped the album shut, my chest tightening. Why was I doing this to myself? I had walked away from that life. So why did it still haunt me? That night I tried to act normal. I cooked dinner, something I hadn't done in weeks, and set the table, pouring Stephen a glass of wine as I waited for him to come home. But hours passed and the food grew cold. Finally my phone buzzed. Stephen. Tied up with work. Don't wait up. I let the phone slip from my hands. I had given up everything for this man. I had torn my family apart for him, and he couldn't even bother to come home. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. This was what I had chosen. A man who didn't need me. A house that wasn't a home. I poured myself another glass of wine, staring at the empty seat across from me. For the first time I wondered if James and Sophie were eating dinner together. If she was laughing. If she had forgotten me already. The next morning I woke up with a pounding headache, my mouth dry from too much wine. I groaned, reaching for my phone, expecting another empty screen. But there was a message. From an unknown number. Unknown. I assume you're aware Stephen is having dinner with another woman right now? My stomach dropped. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the message, my hands shaking. It had to be a mistake. A joke. Someone trying to get under my skin. I swallowed hard, typing back quickly. Me? Who is this? 3 dots appeared, then a response. Unknown. A friend. But you already know I'm right, don't you? I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around my phone. No. Stephen wouldn't do this to me. Would he? I scrambled out of bed, my head spinning as I grabbed my keys. I wasn't going to sit here and wonder. I needed to see for myself. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place Stephen liked to take clients when he wanted to impress them. I parked across the street, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest burned with something I hadn't felt in years. Jealousy. Betrayal. I spotted him instantly. Stephen sat at a candlelit table near the window, leaning in slightly, that signature smirk on his face. And across from him? A woman. She was young. Beautiful. The kind of woman Stephen always surrounded himself with. She laughed at something he said, her hand reaching out to touch his. And he let her. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I had left my husband, my child, my entire life for this man. And now? Now he was already moving on. I didn't confront him. I didn't storm in and demand answers. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching the man I had given everything for prove that I had meant nothing to him. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had thought leaving James would give me freedom, that it would make me feel powerful. But now, sitting alone in my car, staring at the wreckage of my life, I realized the truth. I wasn't free. I was just lost. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I would ever find my way back. I drove home in silence, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had expected a rush of emotions, rage, devastation, maybe even regret. But instead there was only a dull, hollow ache in my chest. Stephen had done exactly what I had feared. He had replaced me, and it hadn't even taken long. The worst part wasn't that he was with someone else. The worst part was how little he had hesitated, how effortlessly he had discarded me the way I had discarded James. I parked in the driveway but didn't move. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. This wasn't my home. Not anymore. When I finally stepped inside, the silence felt suffocating. I tossed my purse onto the counter, glancing at the empty wine bottles from the night before. I had never been much of a drinker before Stephen, but it had become a habit, one that dulled the sharp edges of my thoughts just enough to keep me from falling apart. I poured myself a glass without thinking. I stared at the swirling red liquid, my mind replaying the moment at the restaurant. The way Stephen had leaned in close. The way he had touched her hand, just lightly enough to make it seem unintentional. I had given up everything for him, and yet he hadn't even looked back. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. What had I expected? That he would treat me differently? That I was special? No. I had been temporary just like everything else in his life. I downed the wine in one long gulp, the burn doing nothing to stop the numbness creeping in. The house felt emptier than ever. For the first time in weeks, I let myself admit the truth. I missed them. I missed James's quiet steadiness, the way he made me coffee every morning without me asking, the way he rubbed my shoulders after a long day, even when I was too tired to appreciate it. I missed Sophie's laughter filling the house, the way she wrapped her arms around me so tightly, like she was afraid to let go. I had told myself that this was what I wanted, that I had needed more. But now, standing in this empty house with nothing but regret, I realized I had already had everything, and I had thrown it away. I reached for my phone before I could stop myself. I hesitated. Would James even answer? Did I deserve for him to? My thumb hovered over his name. Then, without giving myself a chance to rethink it, I tapped the screen. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then, click. His voice came through the speaker, quiet and even. What do you want, Laura? I opened my mouth, but for the first time in my life, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him everything. That I had made a mistake. That I had been blind. That I hadn't realized what I had until it was too late. But the words caught in my throat. James was silent, waiting. Finally, I swallowed hard and forced out. Can I see Sophie? A long pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder than I had ever heard it. Why? The question knocked the breath from my lungs. Not when, not of course. Just why? Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. Because I miss her. James let out a slow breath. You don't get to do that, Laura. I stiffened. Do what? Pretend you care now that your new life isn't working out the way you planned. I felt like I had been slapped. That's not fair. Fair. James let out a humorless laugh. Fair was you saving a plate for your daughter on Thanksgiving. Fair was you thinking about her before you walked out of her life. But you didn't. I closed my eyes, the guilt crushing me. James. She cried for you, he said, his voice sharper now. For days. She asked me what she did wrong. And I had to be the one to tell her it wasn't her. That it was you. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if I could stop my heart from shattering. I had done this. To her. To him. To myself. I just want to see her, I whispered. James sighed heavily. I'll think about it. Then click. The line went dead and I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling like I had been gutted. I had never felt more alone, more lost, more unwanted. I had left James and Sophie behind and now they were leaving me behind. I grabbed the wine bottle and poured another glass, ignoring the shaking in my hands. Then another. And another. I didn't stop until the room blurred around me, until the ache in my chest faded into the background. I had no one. No home. No family. And for the first time since this all began, I understood something I had never wanted to admit. I had ruined my own life, and I had no idea how to fix it. The hangover hit me like a truck the next morning. I groaned, pressing my fingers to my temples, willing the pounding in my skull to stop. My mouth was dry, my body sluggish, and the bitter taste of last night's regret still lingered on my tongue. The empty wine bottle sat on the nightstand. Beside it, my phone. And all I could think about was the call with James. "She cried for you." I squeezed my eyes shut, as if I could block out his voice. It didn't work. Sophie had cried for me. And I hadn't been there. I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled into the kitchen. Stephen wasn't home. I checked my phone, but there were no texts from him. No missed calls. I didn't even know if he had come back last night. I poured a glass of water, my hand shaking as I drank. The silence in the house felt heavier today, suffocating, pressing against my ribs. This house was never mine. It had always been Stephen's. I had just been a guest, a temporary fixture in his life. And now I was starting to wonder if my time here was almost up. By the time Stephen finally came home that evening, I had convinced myself that I was overthinking everything. He wasn't replacing me. He wasn't pulling away. He was just busy. That's what I told myself anyway. But when he walked in, he didn't greet me, didn't kiss me, didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, he poured himself a drink, loosened his tie, and collapsed onto the couch with his phone in hand. I swallowed hard. Long day. He didn't look up. Yeah. I hesitated. I called James yesterday. That got his attention. He lifted an eyebrow, setting his drink down. And I shifted uncomfortably. I asked if I could see Sophie. Stephen's lips twitched, almost like he was amused. And I exhaled. He said he'd think about it. Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. So that's a no. I stiffened. It's not a no. Laura. He gave me a pointed look. You really think he's going to let you just waltz back in? You think that kid is waiting by the window, hoping her mother will come crawling back? The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I clenched my fists. She's my daughter. Stephen sighed, rubbing his temple like I was exhausting him. Yeah, and you walked out on her. I flinched. I didn't. You did. His voice was calm, even. You made your choice, Laura. You can't be surprised that James isn't rolling out the red carpet for you. I swallowed hard, looking away. He was right. Of course he was right. But it still hurt to hear it. Stephen stood, downing the rest of his drink. You need to stop chasing ghosts. I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He smirked, stepping closer, his voice dropping. James isn't your husband anymore. Sophie isn't your responsibility anymore. You're free. Start acting like it. I stared at him. Free. That was what I had wanted, wasn't it? So why did it feel like a curse? Stephen went out again that night. I didn't ask where. I already knew. I sat on the couch staring at my phone, debating if I should call James again. But I didn't. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts, stopping at a familiar name. Alan. He was one of Stephen's business acquaintances, a man who had always looked at me just a little too long, smiled at me just a little too much. And tonight I needed to feel like I still mattered to someone. I hesitated. Then before I could talk myself out of it, I tapped the screen. The phone rang twice before he answered. Laura. His voice was warm, surprised. Didn't expect to hear from you. I swallowed. Are you busy? There was a brief pause. Then a knowing chuckle. Not at all. I met Alan at a hotel bar across town. I told myself it was just drinks. Just conversation. Just a way to forget, even for a little while. But as the night went on, the lines blurred. He leaned in closer. I let him. He touched my hand. I didn't pull away. And when he suggested we take this upstairs, I hesitated. Only for a moment before nodding. Maybe this was what I deserved. Maybe this was what I had become. A woman who had nothing left to lose. A woman who had destroyed everything good in her life. A woman who no longer recognized herself. And so, without a second thought, I let myself fall. I woke up in a hotel room that wasn't mine. The sheets were unfamiliar. The air smelled of expensive cologne. And the dull ache in my head wasn't just from the alcohol. It was from regret. I turned my head, my heart pounding as I saw Alan lying beside me, still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. The events of the night before crashed down on me all at once. His hands on my skin, my own desperate need to feel wanted, to feel something other than the emptiness swallowing me whole. And now here I was. I had spent months convincing myself that leaving James was about chasing a better life, that I deserved more, that Stephen was the answer. And yet, here I was, waking up in yet another man's bed. What had I become? I slipped out of bed carefully, gathering my clothes as quietly as I could. The last thing I needed was some awkward morning conversation, some forced goodbye. I wanted to be gone before Alan even opened his eyes. But as I reached for my shoes, his voice broke the silence. "You leaving already?" I froze. Slowly, I turned to see him watching me, his face unreadable. I forced a small smile. "Yeah, I should get going." He stretched lazily, smirking. "No goodbye kiss?" I let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head. "Don't push your luck." He grinned, but there was something else behind his eyes. Something knowing. "Fair enough. But you'll call me again." It wasn't a question. I didn't respond, because we both knew the answer to be why the time I got back to Stephen's house, my house, I reminded myself, he was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I walked in. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder. For a moment I considered sneaking upstairs, avoiding the conversation I knew was coming. But Stephen finally spoke, his voice casual. "Late night." I swallowed hard. "Yeah." He smirked, finally glancing up. Should I even ask? I stared at him, trying to read his expression. Was he jealous? Angry? Hurt? No. He was amused. Like he had expected this. Like it didn't bother him at all. I felt something sharp twist in my chest. "Do you even care?" He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "About what?" I clenched my jaw. "That I was with someone else." Stephen shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Laura, let's not pretend this is something it's not." My stomach dropped. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sighed, setting his cup down. "You're not my wife. You're not James's wife. You're just a woman who made a bad bet." My breath hitched. "Excuse me." His eyes were cold now, assessing. "You thought leaving James would get you something better. That being with me would make you someone important. But let's be honest." He smirked. "You were just a distraction." The words hit harder than I expected. I had known deep down that I wasn't Stephen's forever, that he had never loved me the way James once had. But hearing it so plainly, so dismissively, it shattered me. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Stephen stood, grabbing his keys from the counter. "Pack your things." The air was sucked from my lungs. "What?" He didn't even look at me. "I think we're done here." Just like that. Like I was nothing. Like I had never mattered at all. That I sat on the floor of the bedroom, surrounded by half-packed suitcases, staring blankly at the wall. Where was I supposed to go? I had no home. No family. No one who wanted me. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking, and scrolled to James's number. He was the only person I had left. The only one who might give me another chance. I tapped the screen, pressing the phone to my ear. It rang. Once. Twice. Then. Click. His voice came through, steady. "Laura." I swallowed hard, gripping the fabric of my shirt. "James, I hesitated. I wanted to say I was sorry. I wanted to say I had made a mistake. I wanted to say I wanted to come home. But before I could, James sighed. "I know why you're calling," he said quietly. "And the answer is no." Tears burned in my eyes. "James, please." "You left," he said, his voice harder now. "You made it clear we weren't enough for you." I felt like I was drowning. You chose Stephen," he continued. "You chose that life." I shook my head. "I didn't." "Yes, you did." Silence. Then softer. "Sophie stopped asking about you." A choked sob escaped my throat. "She's happy, Laura," James said. "She's finally okay." I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the tears fall freely. "Don't call again." Then, click. The line went dead and I sat there, staring at my phone, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. James was gone. Sophie was gone. Stephen was gone. I had nothing left. And for the first time I realized I deserved it. I sat in the empty bedroom for what felt like hours, my body numb, my mind blank. James had hung up on me. Sophie had stopped asking about me. Stephen had thrown me out like I was nothing. And maybe I was. I had spent so long chasing something better, something bigger, convincing myself that James and Sophie were holding me back, that I was meant for more. But now, sitting in a half-packed room with nowhere to go, I realized the truth. I had never been trapped. I had been safe. James had been my anchor. Sophie had been my heart. And I had torn myself away from them. I blinked at the ceiling, my throat dry, my body aching. What now? Where does a woman like me go when there's nowhere left? I finished packing, though I had no real plan for where I was going. I had some money left in my account. Not much, but enough to keep me afloat for a little while. I could get a hotel for a few nights. Maybe stay with Christine, though I doubted she would want to be tangled in my mess. I thought about calling Alan, but the idea made me sick. I had already fallen so low. I wasn't about to sink further. I zipped up my suitcase, took one last look at the bedroom that was never mine, and walked out the door. As I stepped into the cold November air, I found myself driving aimlessly. The city lights blurred past me, the road stretching endlessly. But somehow, I ended up in front of James's house. I didn't even remember making the turn onto his street. I just sat in my car, staring at the home I used to belong to. The lights were on. Warm. Inviting. Through the front window I could see James sitting on the couch, reading. Sophie was curled up next to him, her little head resting against his arm, her tiny fingers clutching the stuffed rabbit I had dropped off days ago. My vision blurred with tears. They looked happy, like they had moved on, like they had built something stronger without me. I wasn't part of their world anymore. I had no right to be. I let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel. I could go to the door, knock, beg, but James had made himself clear. And deep down I knew I didn't deserve another chance. So instead I whispered a broken goodbye. Then I put the car in drive and disappeared into the night. I checked into a small, cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled like stale cigarettes. The bed was stiff. The flickering fluorescent light in the bathroom cast harsh shadows across my face. This was where I belonged now. Not in a warm house filled with love. Not at a Thanksgiving table surrounded by family. Here. Alone. I lay down on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The night I walked away. The way Sophie had cried. The way James had looked at me when he picked up her things. The cold finality in his voice when he told me not to call again. I had thought leaving them would make me someone. Instead, it had turned me into nothing. I closed my eyes, a single tear slipping down my cheek. For the first time I truly understood. I had ruined everything. And there was no going back.